Great. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to our second panel on advances with methods. It's my pleasure to introduce our three wonderful speakers for today's panel. We have with us Omar Al-Ubaydli. Omar is the research director at the Bahrain Center for Strategic, International, and Energy Studies, and is also an affiliate associate professor of economics at Georgia Mason University. And Omar today is going to talk to us about strategic and non-strategic reasons why small-scale results often fail to scale up. His talk will be followed by Jonathan Libgober's talk. Jonathan is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, and he will talk about research registries. And our last speaker, last panelist is Dina Pomeranz, who is the UBS Foundation Assistant Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Zurich. We'll talk about how to set up research collaboration with government agencies. I guess we could start go in order and start with Omar. Omar, feel free to share your slides. And as always, if the audience have questions, you can always use the Q&A. And we will. I will convey the questions to the panelists.
Thank you very much, Luigi. Thank you to John and to Rob for inviting me to present today. Thank you to the audience for attending. As Luigi mentioned, strategic and non-strategic reasons why small-scale results often fail to scale up. This presentation is a condensed version of a series of papers I've been working on recently with John List, Dana Suskin, Vincent Lee, and Claire Macavicius from the University of Chicago, which look at the issue of scaling up. So what do we mean by the scale-up effect? To give you a definition, it's the tendency for estimated net treatment effects of interventions that are originally estimated in small-scale experiments to diminish when scaled up, for example, as part of a population level rollout. So just to unpack that definition, first of all, when you run a small scale experiment, you estimate a treatment effect. Here we're interested in a net treatment effect, as in a treatment effect that takes into account the cost of an intervention. And we often find, and it's not a universal rule, across the social sciences, that when we conduct studies at small scale, whether it's a lab experiment or a small scale field experiment, obtain promising results, seek to roll them out at a higher level. The results, the net treatment effect estimated tends to zero, which is not good scientifically and for a variety of reasons. And this tendency is so widespread in the social sciences that it's earned the name, it's been assigned the name scale-up effect by us, but following a long literature which assigned it the name the voltage effect too. And in social intervention literature, it's also referred to as an issue of fidelity of implementation, which I'll get into shortly. As an example, the early Head Start program looked at the effect of home visits and child and parental outcomes. This is a commonly cited example. And there were promising results found at small scale from sending people to the families of the target groups. When they scaled up, with the expectation that these results would be replicated at a higher scale, the net treatment effects were found to be much smaller and embarrassingly so. Why is it a scourge? Well, there's two reasons. First, it's a waste. It wastes valuable resources. Rolling anything out at a large scale is very expensive, and obviously we don't want to be doing that unless we have a good sense that's something that's going to be worthwhile and successful. And equally, the reason for the picture I'm broadcasting or I'm putting on the presentation is that it undermines the public's trust in the value of science. If experts, scientists and so on are going to market themselves as people who can solve society's problems, and then when they and their proposals are based on studies which are valid epistemologically at small scale, but when they scale up, they don't work, then that's going to make the public doubt the value of the scientists, and obviously in the long run, that can have very adverse effects on the quality of policy making. The title is strategic versus non-strategic, but actually I'm going to use a slightly different taxonomy, which is going to be non-stochastic versus stochastic, and you'll see that distinction in a moment. The key players in this environment, this is our favorite game theorist, Russell Crowe. Firstly, scientists who want to describe their goals, they want replicable results, and that's something which Jonathan is going to be speaking about in his section. Obviously, it's not good for a scientist to write something or present an argument and then it turns out that their experiment is non-replicable. But they also want publishable results. They want something that's going to be eye-catching enough to merit publication in a high status journal. They also want low-cost results. Researchers have fixed budgets and they want to conduct studies which are limited in cost so that they can conduct as many more studies. They also want consulting revenues and the prestige associated with large-scale rollouts of their program. So if my experiment happens to be used by policymakers in Bahrain, which is where I'm from, then in principle, sadly it hasn't happened yet, but in principle I could earn some consulting revenues and some extra followers on Twitter. So these are all valuable goals from my perspective. Then there's the prospective participants, the subjects, if you will, who want to participate in experiments that are likely to benefit them. And so they lower their participation costs accordingly. So this might seem a little bit abstract in the case of economics experiments, but you can see it much more clearly in medical experiments. If you're going to do some sort of medical intervention, some sort of new treatment, it's going to be a lot easier to recruit people who are potentially going to benefit hugely from it, especially if the alternative to this experimental technique is potentially death or some sort of debilitating illness. And that's important when inferentially, as we'll see in a moment. Then we have journal editors, who are the gatekeepers. They're the people who organize or oversee the process of a piece of research being disseminated and given the seal of approval. Although now with things like ArchiveX and SSRN and REPEC and so on, their role in some sense is decreasing in importance. Whereas previously, I should say, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, it would not have been possible to disseminate, to have for a working paper to have big influence without it being published in a high status journal. Nowadays, that possibly does exist. When I did my PhD thesis, the main paper, which is on the resource curse, the main paper we cited was Sachs and Warner 1995, which is an NBR paper, and that still hasn't been published, and it's got thousands, if not tens of thousands of citations. But in general, journal editors do play an important role, and they want eye-catching results. And they also want, that may conflict with their long-run desire to publish replicable results. We've seen in psychology and other fields now efforts to make the results that are presented in journals more statistically robust. However, they are susceptible behaviorally to the winner's curse, which creates the publication bias, possibly not because they succumb to it themselves, but vicariously because their consumers and principals, the people who read journals, are susceptible to eye-catching results and big treatment effects being published. And it's plausible that an editor will think, well, look, by the time this result gets debunked, I'll be retired and I don't have to worry about it at that point. And finally, government officials who want to roll out programs that have high positive net treatment effects. This is taking quite a positive or altruistic view of our social planners. But they're also susceptible to evaluate, but their problem is that they're susceptible to evaluating proposals at face value because they don't have the expertise and they don't understand the incentive structure that scientists face. So very brief, I'm not going to model this. We do model this, but I'm not going to model. I'm going to talk through it narratively. What are some of the non-stochastic reasons for the scale-up effect? So this picture here of the bureaucracy captures one of the key elements. Why is it that a result that we find, big net treatment effect that we find in a small scale experiment, when we try to roll it out, we may find a problem. The first is that what we call within treatment spillovers. So an intervention that, so to give you an example, and by that I mean some treatment effects, some interventions, when you scale them up, then there are spillovers which affect the treatment effect. Now this, I should say, could go both ways. It could be that there's positive or negative spillover. So this does not necessarily mean there's going to be a scale-up problem in general, just that there's going to be a different outcome, different treatment effect when you scale up. However, in some cases, we do find evidence that there are the sort of spillovers which attenuate treatment effects when we scale up. An example that would be negative spillovers would be if I have some sort of intervention that makes a CV stand out visually without improving its capacity to convey information in an intangible way, maybe something that makes the CV look pretty or has a big, attractive font. Obviously, if I scale that up to the entire labor pool, I'm not going to do, this is a sort of zero-sum intervention, which is not going to have an effect at the level of the population, whereas it will have an effect if I do it for a small group, which is what I might be doing in the lab or in a small-scale field experiment. Secondly, between treatment spillovers, one of my co-authors, John List, has found this in his own work. So if you have a pre-kindergarten intervention where there was a spillover from the treatment group to the control group, and that spillover became stronger the larger the group upon whom the experiment was being conducted. So at the national level, this becomes much more of an issue. In small scale, you can isolate and separate treatment groups from control groups, but if it's so here they found that the control group benefited as a spillover from the intervention that the treatment group was benefiting from, and so this led to an attenuation in the estimated treatment effect. Now, in this case, it's not necessarily a bad thing from the perspective of the social good, but it is an explanation a potential explanation for the statistical anomaly of the scale-up effect. Then the reason for the picture, managerial diseconomies of scale, including mounting opposition from entrenched interests. So if I want to try a small-scale experiment, I'm not going to run into entrenched interests. It's going to be relatively straightforward. Anyone, all of you have run field experiments. You've seen how relatively straightforward they are to run when the number of subjects or participants is in the dozens or even fewer, and you've got good support. But when you're trying to do this thing with thousands of people, it becomes a completely different animal, and you need a much larger administrative infrastructure. Now, in principle, there could be managerial economies of scale, but given how effective the teams that small-scale research teams, the effectiveness of small-scale research teams administratively, more often than not, it's going to be diseconomies of scale. And then the increasing marginal cost of inputs, especially since facilities and project management team and staff are often free from the researcher's perspective when conducting a study at the university. When we were graduate students, we were probably working, quote unquote, for free pro bono, maybe in exchange for being authors on experiments. Our salaries were paid, our stipends were paid. We could use rooms on campus for free. We could use all sorts of goodies for free. But then if this intervention is going to be scaled up to the level of population, we can't rely on high quality free labor from elite graduate students. We can't rely on high quality free facilities at the university, and these increasing marginal costs are going to mean that the net treatment effect, not necessarily the gross treatment effect, but the net treatment effect is going to head towards zero. Moving on to stochastic reasons for the scale-up effect, and here this image is supposed to capture the idea of something going viral, and that's really the essence of the stochastic reasons, or the strategic reasons in some sense. So first of all, scientists using an unrepresentative pool of participants. What do we mean by that? Well, first of all, scientists, because of the motivations I spelled out in a couple of slides ago, they'll tend to recruit those with lower participation costs to economize on the program budget. So a scientist who's not really trying to skew results in any way, but they'll go out and try to find people who are cheaper to recruit, not because they want to, distort the results, but just because they have a fixed budget, and it's going to be cheaper to recruit people who are going to cost less to recruit. And sometimes, as in the case I mentioned of a medical trial or something like that, the people who are going to be cheaper to recruit are going to be the ones who tend to have a larger treatment effect because they want to benefit from the intervention. And so that's going to make the implementation costs taken at face value without a suitable correction appear smaller than they will be at scale. Secondly, they'll recruit those who will likely exhibit the largest pew treatment effect. So this is more strategic and somewhat nefarious, because they want to produce results that are more publishable and more likely to catch the eye of government officials. And that's what this, this image is about. if I want to do an experiment and I've got my eyes on, a job position in the Council of Economic Advisors, or I want to be, the next person on the cover of Time magazine because of my fantastic intervention and program, which is life-changing, earth-shattering, etc., my chances of doing that, if I can game the system well, are going to be higher if I can, strategically and somewhat surreptitiously select the people who are going to have higher treatment effects to be my participants. And then I'm not really lying if I'm saying, hey, look, this is what I found, because those are the results that are accurate portrayal of the data. The question is how honest or dishonest the researchers being when they anticipate or proclaim that something similar will occur when the program is rolled out nationally. And then you have the winner's curse in publications. So you're all familiar with publication bias, which is an analog to the winner's curse in common value auctions. If we all if 100 of us conduct the same experiment, and the reality is that there's a none result, then loosely speaking, 5 out of the 100 of us will find a significant result. There'll be a false positive, and those 5 will be more likely to get published by editors who are either naive, hyperbolic discounters, or vicariously invoking the preferences of their readers, or whatever behavioral way you want to categorize it, or they have ulterior motives, and so on and so forth. And then inferential areas in Bayesian updating and in assessing the value of replication. And this is a paper by Maniadis et al. In AER 2014, which is, John was also a co-author on, which is looking at how do we when we see a published result, do we interpret the results precisely in the context of all the research that was done that was not published? Do we understand statistically the value of an independent replication? And in reality is that because these things usually don't occur in the way that we should be doing them, they contribute to the likelihood of a result not scaling up. Countermeasures, and this is a nice bastion for illustrating the idea of backwards induction. How do we, in light of these potential sources of the scale-up problem, what can we do in advance of running our experiments and studies in an attempt to attenuate the scale-up effect and ideally eliminate it? So this is there's a paper which was just published in a special issue of Behavioral Public Policy, which actually makes 12 proposals. Let's go through most of them very briefly, and on what you can do in advance to deal with this problem. The first is to use the correct statistical methods to correct for inferential problems. So this is what the Maniadis et al. Paper spells out, and what many papers which look at publication bias. You've seen meta-analyses which make these corrections. Sadly, if casual observation is anything to go by, despite the effort exerted by a minority of the scientific community to make corrections to these sorts of things, I think it's fair to say that across natural sciences, across social sciences, many scholars are still unaware of exactly how to correct for publication bias and so on and so forth. And also how to assess the value of replication. And perhaps the biggest evidence of scientists and scholars' inability to accurately gauge the value of replication is how little our disciplines value replication professionally. And which is on to the second countermeasure, which is rewarding scholars for attempting to replicate. And by rewarding, we don't mean sort of clapping or giving them a slap on the back. We mean letting them publish in the top journals. And I don't think, by the way, that a good solution is producing niche journals that cater for this case. What you really need is top journals which to also welcome replication with the same zeal and fervor which they welcome the eye-catching positive results, and then obviously promotions and grants and the other reward mechanisms we have in our profession. Second, reward scholars for producing results that independently replicate, so going even a step back in the game theoretic chain, rather than just rewarding people for replicate. If you're someone who produces, once your paper is published, if it turns out that it replicates, backload or some of the benefits or some of the prize and give you even more prestige and promotions and so on. If it turns out that your results are ones that withstand slings and arrows of attempted replication. Reward scholars for null findings, especially type zeros. This is not a new suggestion. This has been circulating for 30 years at least. Publication bias is not something that has just been discovered in the last 2 or 3 years. However, it is the case that it hasn't caught on. People still scoff at null findings, and it's one of those ones where people all say, yeah, I think we should have null findings. We need to tackle publication bias. But the reality is that when they're referees or editors, they position their revealed preference suggests otherwise. Conduct and model multi-site trials where possible prior to scaling to endogenize scaling. So rather than just doing it in your university community or whatever, actually allow your model to incorporate the potential heterogeneity as you scale, the potential variation in the input costs and so on and so forth, so that scaling is modeled explicitly and where possible measured as you scale. Using technology where possible to encourage standardization. So this is a reference to the managerial diseconomies of scale. The more humans are involved, the more problems you're going to have replicating. But if you can use a program to the greatest extent possible, then obviously you can get around some of these problems. Include the original scientists in the national rollout to improve fidelity. I'm sure that the original scientists themselves will not complain about this. But there are many political barriers to this happening. So ensuring that this is a step can help limit the incidence of scale-up problems. Researchers should measure and report spillovers where possible. So this talks about that when I mentioned the between and within treatment spillovers. Some of these things are very hard to spot and ex ante not be aware of them, but once the experiment is done, in the act of conducting the experiment, the scholar, the conducting researcher may become aware of them, and these should be documented and measured to the greatest extent possible in an effort to prevent them from distorting results. Researchers ultimately, should backwards induct, as I mentioned, to facilitate rapid scaling. So they should imagine when they start doing their experiment that, well, if I actually find something very significant and important, what's going to happen? And given that X, Y, Z is going to happen, what should I do in order to prevent X, Y, and Z from generating a scale-up effect? Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Luigi.
Thank you so much, Omar. So we'll kick off questions with a question from Dina. Dina, do you want to ask yourself, or should I read it?
Yeah, just because you were saying incentivizing replications. And one concern I currently see that there is some degree of incentive for replications that overturn the original results, because that's what's going to make a splash and potentially be published. And there's not an incentive to do a replication that confirms the original results, which now again gives some perverse incentives to potentially p-hack the replications and give false rejection in a way of the original analysis. So do you have any thoughts on how we could change that?
Yeah, so this is, in the natural sciences, this is called the Proteus Effect, where you get, first of all, Omar publishes a result which is a false positive, and that becomes, I publish it in Nature or Science, and it becomes, a standard. And then for years, everyone believes it until there's enough replications where people find out it's not true. Then we swing the other way, and it becomes, everyone's fixated on being null. And then eventually Luigi finds something positive, and you're just gyrating from extreme. And it's obviously, epistemologically not a good way of doing things. How do you incentivize it? I mean, I think it's quite clear in the sense that, the editors at the highest level of the profession, you gather the heads of the American Economic Association, European Economic Association, so on and so forth. You get these people, you put them in a room, and you say, look, this is clearly a problem which is affecting the profession. Look what happened to psychologists. Their reputation took a serious dent from their own delayed internal audit. Do we want to, as a profession, we need to collectively decide to do this and just literally issue some sort of directive to the journals that you have to do this. And then the way you'd and then to make it operational, you'd say, you'd entertain. Now, Jonathan, when he discusses the registration methods, I think one of the results he'll get to is that if done correctly, registrations can solve the problem. And so if you actually, entertain proposals for the experiments that are going to be the replications, and ex ante commit to publishing whatever the results are. That's how you get it. But it requires a collective will at the top level.
Thank you.
I have one question, Omar. So in your theories with Dina and John, you touch upon many reasons why scaling might not work. But in practice, researchers, and you talk about how replication may, for some of those, be an answer. So for instance, replicating exactly the same design, or replicating sort of the same concept, but in a slightly different environment. But sometimes there are trade-offs between, sometimes there are trade-offs between replicating a design and scaling up a design. So what are your thoughts on sort of, going for running bigger studies versus, conducting somewhat smaller scale studies, but try to replicate that. These are not exactly the same, and sometimes this might be a trade-off for research.
Yeah, so I agree with you. If you have fixed budgets, then there's a trade-off, right? You can allocate your budget to replicating, you can allocate your budget to scaling up, and so on and so forth. And you can't do everything. Partially, I'm going to cop out by saying, well, it depends on the specific context. But what I'll affirm is that at the moment, despite the efforts of you, for example, in your paper with John on the replications and others, the incentives to replicate at the discipline level are still very, very weak. And so inevitably, people are going to be drawn to scaling up rather than replicating, unless, as Dina mentioned, they're replicating in an attempt to debunk a result. So I think that to make the trade, at the moment, the trade-off is not really a trade-off. I don't know, I can barely think of, the amount of resources dedicated to replications are very, very limited in economics. And most top scholars just do not even bother with it. So the trade-off exists, but I think at the moment we're just doing too little of the replication. And so the first step would be to implement the measures that make, at the professional level, replication more attractive. And then we can worry about fine-tuning. But at the moment, I'm not seeing top scholars and top research labs allocating much to replication. Now, I would say that in lab experiments, there is a tradition of replication. And that's partially because lab experiments are so easy to replicate, and that's one of their virtues. And in fact, I think some lab experimentalists, in responding to the sort of psychology crisis, were quite, because when lab experiments did the same replication that psychologists did, they found slightly higher levels of robustness, and this was a source of pride. And I think it's worth mentioning that is one of the key advantages of lab experiments. But in general, in field experiments, we're not seeing replication anywhere near the level it should be.
Thanks, Omar. I think in the interest of time, we could move on to the next presentation. There's one question in the Q&A from Francis Annan. If you don't mind, I will keep it at the end, so we keep the talks flowing, and then we'll come back to you, Omar, with one question. Jonathan, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. It's a real thrill to be presenting my work on the research registries in general, as well as the AEA RCT registry in particular. This has been joint work with Elliot Abrams. This talk is mostly borrowing from some joint work I've done with Elliot Abrams and John List. It's just been a real delight to work with them. The title is Taking Stock and Looking Forward. I would think of the taking stock as the empirical part of our work, and the looking forward is the empirical part. I think this topic is likely, anyone, if you've run a field experiment, I imagine many of you are likely intimately familiar with this, but even if you aren't, I'll be talking about what a registry is, why it might be useful, and then tell you about our assessment of how it's been doing. I think Omar's talk was a nice setup for this, because a lot of the motivation for a research registry comes from this observation that publication will inevitably select on outcomes. Whether or not it should be that way is a separate question. I think the fact is that this does happen, and furthermore, that this can introduce distortions into both the dissemination as well as the initial conduct of an experiment. And so this presents a problem, right, in terms of external validity as well as generalizability, since presumably, you know, the universe of experiments that are conducted are more close to reality than the universe of experiments that are published. Okay, and so you might think that one way to try to minimize these distortions or correct them is to allow for the documentation of experiments in a way that's independent from the publication process. Okay, and that's exactly what a registry does. So what a registry does and what registration does is allow researchers to describe in very basic terms what the treatment arms and as well as the results of the experiment that they're looking at are going to be. In principle, if you register an experiment, you write down the main observations you'll be looking at. And then after the fact, you can update the findings independently of publication, at least in principle. So one thing we find is that actually doesn't happen a ton, but in principle, this can provide a way of documenting experiments that are being done. And I think of this as kind of decoupling the publication and dissemination of research, because it's saying we can have really an institution that keeps track of all experiments that are conducted without having to, without necessarily needing to look at, final published findings. And so I think of in terms of the welfare implications of the registry, I think there's kind of two main forces. The first I'll call a private benefit, by which I mean a benefit that's accrued to the researcher themselves. Which is that when you register an experiment, you have some credible claim that you knew what you were going to be looking for, and that you didn't, for instance, just repeat the analysis because you didn't find the result you wanted. It also lets, in terms of thinking through the design, it kind of forces researchers to think through what do they want to look at, and you might also think that kind of added care or that framework of thinking through the outcomes really does actually improve the experiment itself. Okay, but there also is this public benefit in that, perhaps, Omar also talked about researcher incentives. For sure the researchers may themselves be internalizing the, social good of their experiments, but putting that aside, I think it's safe to say that having this documentation of the universe of conducted experiments is something that the public at large benefits outside of the researcher's own individual career. Now, one thing I want to point out is that it's not necessary when you're doing a registration to describe all of the analysis. That's sort of a separate issue. So in other words, as part of a registration, it's not necessary to do a pre-analysis plan as well. Although there is a lot of overlap, so some details, so there is overlap. You can have a pre-analysis plan as part of the registration, and conversely, if you're doing a pre-analysis plan, having the registration may help putting that together, but ultimately these are separate details. Now that said, in order for these registrations to have any meaning, it's kind of obvious that there should be some informational content for these registrations. If I just say I'm doing an experiment on money, that's not really going to tell you very much in terms of either documenting what I'm going to do or even giving me any credibility that I'm sticking to it. So what we do in this project is we empirically and theoretically look at how registries tackle two implications of this public, I'll say the dissemination side and the conduct side of the implications of publication bias. The first being the file drawer problem, namely that results are often found and then forgotten, as well as the p-hacking issues, namely that this publication bias may encourage researchers to select for specifications that look out for the positive results. I'll briefly mention, I think, p-hacking, I think the welfare implications are a lot more ambiguous than file drawers. So for instance, you might think a researcher kind of conducts an experiment, they get some result, but then they actually find a much better experiment that they could run after the fact, and they just didn't think about it. You know, it's a little hard to say that it's necessarily welfare detrimental for them to conduct the better experiment. But at the same time, you know, the issue in terms of generalizability is in not knowing what was done. So I think a lot of the problems people have with p-hacking is that you make some inference based on what you see, and then you don't see a lot of the other stuff that went into the experiment, and that can lead to a distortion and then therefore also hurt external validity. So we do a lot in the paper. You know, we're very thorough. I'll just walk through a few of our key findings. So I would say our overall tone is that the registry has so far been limited in its effectiveness. We find that around half of the registrations that are in the registry are only done after the completion of the experiment. Now, in this kind of motivation I was just walking through, you might have thought to yourself, well, yeah, this, you know, in order to kind of, certainly to get this credibility benefit, it should be that you're registering before the experiment. And even in the, to solve this file draw problem, presumably the issue is that once you get the negative result, you kind of stop trying to publish it. And so, you know, in order to be effective, you might think that it should be done before. Now, that's an argument. I don't really want to get into the details of whether, you know, how true that is, but I think it's at least a little bit true. And so I think the fact that we are actually seeing a lot of these registrations are only done after the experiment completion is kind of a sign that it's not, you know, that at least it's leaving a lot of room on the table. If you look at the registry, you can actually distinguish between experiments that are registered before or after, but it's unclear how salient they are. And the registration would be, you know, the reason you would register after, I mean, one reason is that it's kind of a requirement in order to submit to an AE journal for you to have this registered. So it's perhaps not so surprising that people would be registering after the fact. We also find that a lot of these published experiments are not registered. This is coming through another census we do. I think one of the more interesting parts of our analysis is in actually going through pre-registrations and trying to assess how detailed they are. So we take a random sample of 300 pre-registrations, and we, you know, grade their level of detail on a scale of 1 to 5. And we find that the average level of detail is 2 degrees of separation. So what does that mean? So, you know, concretely, you can think of the average registration as saying something like how many fruits are consumed by subjects, as opposed to saying number of apples consumed in some time frame. Okay, so it's some detail. You can see that I'm looking at fruit consumption. So there's presumably some plan that I'm following. But it's not really telling you the level of detail in the registration is obviously much less than whatever you would be looking at in the course of the experiment. We do find that researchers aren't exactly lying. So, you know, they are followed somewhat, although perhaps that's not that surprising either, given that we find that they are kind of leaving a lot of flexibility, and that we find by kind of matching to you know, the working papers of the registrations that we find, but they do often add outcomes. Now, what, you know, this is you know, this is maybe not the most inspiring comments. You know, one thing I want to point out is that we don't necessarily view this as economists are messed up or the AEA messed up or anything like that, because we do actually look at clinicaltrials.gov, which is another very popular registry, and we find very similar issues. So this is not. We also find that these registrations often lack detail, and we, you know, have literature survey kind of also documenting significant departures from the intentions of the registries in terms of practice. So I think I'm running a little bit over time. Let me just say we do have a theory model. We focus on the implications of registration timing, partially because that's a very concrete design issue. And what we find is that allowing for late registration can actually have an unintended effect in terms of encouraging substitution across time. So some researchers that are on the margin between registering early and late may decide to kind of delay registration, and in fact that, you know, kind of counteracting the ability for these registrations, the registry to be effective in capturing all conducted experiments. That's kind of a theoretical result. Many people roll their eyes at these theoretical possibility results. We actually calibrate the model and find that if we kind of match the registration rates, we see that in fact a ban would in fact increase overall registration. So even though a ban would lower the kind of ex post registrations, that kind of the substitution effect overwhelms it. And we also have comments on other incentives that are at play. We highlight a trade-off between encouraging experimentation and registration, in that if you kind of raise the cost of experiments, and that can decrease the amount of experimentation that's done. We also suggest linking IRB registration as a possible solution to have the best of both worlds. So the last thought I want to make is that, the last comment is just that I think this issue, what this panel is about, I think is very important. I think every empirical field, not just economics, as Omar was alluding to, these are common issues. I think that economics has two main contributions to broader empirical sciences as a whole. The first is that I think whereas, a lot of fields would think about how do we, this generalizability issue, I think what economics is really about is this question of incentives. And so what I think economics is well suited to do is look at the connection between incentives and inference, as well as thinking about, institutional design and market forces that kind of underlie experimentation. And so, one reason I was so excited about this project is I think, relative to even my own work, other work on this, I think this is a very concrete analysis of how do we design an institution which can make research effective. And I think our message at the end of the day is really that this is a very challenging problem, and it's not something that we can just make work by fiat. It's really something that we have to think about, and it's also very important.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So in the interest of time, I would suggest that we go ahead right away with Dina's presentation, and I'm sure there will be questions flowing in the Q&A, and sort of we'll pack questions for both you and Dina at the end of Dina's talk.
Sounds great.
Dina, feel free to.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, loud and clear.
You can see the presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about working with government agencies in this conference. I know a lot of people in the audience have a lot of experience with this too, and so a lot of this might be redundant for many of the audience, but hopefully there are a couple of insights that might still be relevant. So as you know, there's a growing number of close collaborations of researchers in economics and related fields with various government agencies, both for joint randomized studies, which is the topic of this conference, but also for retrospective analysis of administrative data or qualitative interviews. And so part of this presentation is based on my personal experience working with the tax authorities in Chile, Ecuador, and Kenya, as well as with the Controller Agency of Chile for many years. But also we conducted a survey for an overview paper with 70 researchers who have done academic research with tax authorities. So a lot of these lessons are now collected in the context of tax administrations, but I think most of the lessons carry over to other large government entities. So this presentation essentially is a summary of section 5 of this annual review of economics paper called Taking State Capacity Research to the Field, Insights from Collaborations with Tax Authorities. So the other two parts of that same paper are some key facts about taxation around the world and a summary of the literature that comes out of these types of collaborations, both on the important role of information for tax collection, but also a large and quickly growing literature on other aspects of tax capacity and tax administration. Okay, so for those of you who are interested in tax research more broadly, I invite you to look at the paper. But for today, I'm going to talk a lot about results from this survey. And one thing that we see is that collaborations with governments often have very similar phases. And they can obviously overlap or reoccur multiple times, but I'm going to structure the talk according to these 5 phases. First, establishment of the relationship. Then often there's a phase of qualitative interviews or analysis, potentially piloting of a field intervention. Then comes the issue of data collection, confidentiality, and academic independence. And that actually needs to be covered before you do the data analysis. And then you have the main data analysis, which in general, I mean, much of that is what we do as economists in general, but there are a few points of how you can leverage also the expertise of your research partner in the government. And then very important, do not forget to communicate with the agency about your research results. You would be surprised how often in the end of the very long academic process, this gets lost. So in establishing the relationship, essentially this is a matching problem because it turns out many government agencies are actually interested in the free expertise of academics, but they don't really know where to find this right person, right? And similarly, many researchers are looking for a policy partner. And it's really a question of how can we, help people find each other. In the survey, respondents sometimes reached out to the tax authority directly, some connected at conferences or events, some connected via co-authors who had already worked with an agency before. And I think the main bottom line, especially for young people starting out, is just reach out to many places. Email all the research departments, walk up to people at events, ask colleagues for connections, all of it. For collaborations that go beyond just, hey, can you fork me over some data? It's key to have a strong interest in collaboration also from decision-making persons within the partner agency. You want to make sure that as you go through the process of implementing things, there's somebody inside also fighting for the project so you can partner together with those people. And so for that, it's very helpful to know why are government partners potentially interested in this collaboration. Yeah, you kind of want to know why the other people are in this. The respondents mentioned 6 recurring topics, which very much jives with what I experienced. So often very important is really learning about more effective ways to implement policy. Many people go into policy jobs because they want to, make a positive difference, and they are generally interested in doing a better job. Many times, especially if you work with people in the research departments, they're very excited about learning about new research methods. They might have gone to graduate school a while back, maybe have a master's degree, but haven't obviously been able to keep up with new methods, and are often excited to work together with academics who are more at the forefront of the methodological development. Third is that oftentimes they have ideas or thoughts about cool things they could do with their own data, or they would like to do more research, and they don't have time in the day-to-day urgency of government work. And so they're excited to work with somebody who can bring extra person hours to help leverage that data. Then, receiving independent feedback and analysis from outside sources on relevant issues that they are deciding about or grappling with can be very valuable. Fifth, it can be actually just a fun and stimulating experience for staff who are interested in research to be able to collaborate with academics and do this type of research. And lastly, sometimes it's just the prestige associated with working with academic institutions, depending on the country you work in, that has a very high status, and people are excited in being able to have this type of partnership. So this is sort of in the background. And once then you have this collaboration, it's really important to spend the time necessary to find this topic of mutual interest, right? Because you have your academic interests and what's kind of academically relevant and generalizable enough that there's an audience beyond this specific agency who's interested in. And then it also has to be relevant and of direct interest to the government partner, because they're going to spend a lot of time and energy, and they will only do so if that is actually relevant to their work, which is a good thing because they're paid to do their work. They're not paid to advise academics, right? And so it's a good thing to do that. And also oftentimes the ideas that they bring are super interesting. So in our respondents, we found that 40% of research ideas emerge from this type of joint development of and search for research topics. So here's some quotes from the survey on building and maintaining the relationship. It's key for researchers to put themselves, or they should say shoes, in the shoes of their research partners and to take the time to learn about their experiences, perspective, and needs. It's crucial to have a permanent relationship. Be extremely patient and realize that you are not, nor should you be, their top priority. Make sure you listen carefully to their feedback. They understand the data and institutional details much better than you. Provide frequent feedback and regular updates. Many of the respondents made this a really long-term investment. Over half of them had their collaborations already last for over 4 years, and about half of the research personally spent more than 3 months physically at the agency. So this is sort of how you start getting in touch. Obviously, sometimes a long search process, so a very important phase. And then you're sort of in, they're interested, you want to work together. Here again, some quotes from the survey. Try to embed yourself in the agency for a period. Go and listen to people in the agency. Go with a few loose ideas of what you are interested in, but most of all, with an open-minded, intense curiosity. Conduct qualitative interviews or focus groups to learn more about the context. So this is really key, right? So what rarely will work is if you, coming right out of interesting grad courses, walk into their office and say, here, look, here's what you should be interested in. Or here's how you should do your job better. You know, it might be that it's exactly what they're excited about, but chances are not that large, right? And so oftentimes you also find that they have super interesting ideas or problems that you have never heard about in grad school, which also makes for more novel and innovative research topiks. But also then it's not really a partnership. So it's really about mutual learning. And then piloting, all of you know this is a conference about field experiments, so you know the importance of piloting for academic reasons. But there are also institutional reasons why that's very helpful. It reduces the risk for the agency because you're testing on a small scale, you can address unforeseen problems at a small scale first. So any type of reputational concerns or cost concerns or management concerns can be tested out at a small scale first. And that also helps you to earn buy-in from different parts of the agency because these are large organizations. And so even though maybe the research department is excited, maybe the legal department has concerns or the HR department has concerns or somebody. And so piloting can help a lot with all of these concerns. Okay, now you have gathered a lot of background information, you learned about the context, you did a lot of listening, and now you want to get access to the data. So there's big benefits, obviously, everyone's talking about this administrative government data. They are relatively cheap compared to if you had to do this large survey. They're often very large, sometimes they cover the entire universe. The big challenge is that they're often highly confidential. So that then requires these confidentiality agreements. They can vary from, you can take it offsite after the identification to you have to go on site to only government staff can actually touch the data and you have to send them the code. So this might vary. I just want to emphasize the importance of actually respecting the data agreements because this really is a public good, right? So as academics, more and more agencies are trusting us with data under certain conditions. And if one of us sort of loses highly confidential data in the subway or something, it will have negative spillover effects on all of us getting access to the data. So be respectful and careful about that. Another thing that I think is really important is academic independence. So there have been some cases, right, where there's essentially a veto power of the partner agency ex post to not let you publish it if they don't like the result. That is really bad for a personal level because you have spent maybe 5 years and now they don't let you publish it. But it's also really bad for research. We just talked about publication bias and those issues. And so to avoid this, what you want to do, and this is really important, to define ex ante the scope of what type of result can be published, what type of question can be analyzed, so that ex post, if you follow those guidelines, they cannot veto based on results. So for example, you would obviously say, no individual information can be published, only general tendencies and trends, means, whatever. Describe what you can and cannot publish. or the topic of research if they require that. And so that then they can maybe give you input and comments, but they cannot stop you from publishing the results. That is also very important for your credibility as an academic. Great, so now you have the data, you have the context, maybe you've done your RCT, and what is now the role of the partner organization in the data analysis? Experts from the agency can actually often help you even in that stage, because they have a deep understanding of the data and the context. So some survey respondents said, talk to the frontline people who actually work with the data and who are the main data creators and users. You'll learn that some variables may mean different things than you thought. And this is just for the data itself. And then even on the results, the experts from the partner institution can often provide very helpful feedback on preliminary research results. Why might this be? What potential mechanisms? And this input can also lead to new hypotheses that you can then go back to the data and test again to get a deeper understanding of the interpretation. And last but not least, you want to communicate the results to the government agency. So there's often long collaborations. They often require significant time and effort from individuals within the agency. So it's crucial that the researchers share the results with their partners. Part of this is the research findings, but part of it may also be the research method. For example, giving a workshop on how to do this analysis, the method you used, if it's randomization, maybe about power calculations and randomization code, but also maybe sharing files, how you clean their data, that maybe they can reuse those files, etc. There are other forms of knowledge transfer, such as providing feedback on their internal research that is not your research project, but they often have things that they're working on. And it's kind of like office hours for the government officials, and often very fun, very interesting to see what they do, and often very appreciated. And also inviting your academic partners to conferences on these topics, potential trainings that they may not be aware of. Obviously then you also care about that because, in terms of impact, so over 40% of survey respondents reported that the tax authority adopted research methods that they used in their project later for their own internal analysis, because they often have a research department who can really benefit from these methodological inputs. There's different ways to share the findings. So sending your academic papers seems the obvious, but often that's sort of too technical for a broad part of the government agency to absorb. So people sometimes write policy reports. People often give in-person presentations of the results. The most effective is often if you really have in-depth meetings with the partner and think together about which ways these results might be useful and actionable for them in practice. 64% of respondents reported that policy changes happened based on their study. And in addition, this is really interesting, I hadn't thought about this before I started working with these agencies, there's lots and lots of unexpected additional byproducts because you give them feedback, it's kind of like coming from the outside, you give some suggestions, or things get discovered from the collaboration about how, different parts of the agency who may not typically talk to each other through the RCT now talk, and they start to change their internal processes and so on. So that is something also that a lot of the people in the survey reported that happened to them in their collaboration as well. So in conclusion, there's a growing number of research collaborations between academics and practitioners from government agencies. I think it's a very exciting development. This trend is fueled by increased availability of these large-scale administrative data, but also growing penchant of economists to combine our traditionally quantitative data analysis with fieldwork type research where you really immerse yourself in the context that you're studying to develop different research questions. And there's a renewed interest in the economics literature, in the role of institutions, and in the impact of specific administrative policy, which all support this trend. So these collaborations require a lot of patience, and mutual respect and openness, because it's kind of a clash of different cultures as well, right? The communication style, speed, procedures. But they also provide input from experts from practice directly into the academic process, which can lead to very novel and practically relevant research ideas, and also personally very interesting experiences. So I want to conclude by thanking many of the government partners and experts from whom I have learned so much. I probably would not have stayed in academia if it wasn't for the exciting collaborations with all these people who are, you know, encouraging me and helping sort of do research that feels like very rooted in practice and very relevant to whatever we call the real world. So big thanks to all of them, and I look forward to continued collaborations.
Great. Thank you so much, Dina. We are almost about out of time. We're actually out of time now. So I would like to thank very much the three speakers. It was really interesting research and very, very important topics for our profession. And I think we're going to have a break now, and then we're going to reconvene for the social chat for junior faculty. Thanks.
Thank you very much.